But even though we, produce 16% of the world's stuff, we only export 8% of the world's exports. That's not that much. Now we're down to 8% of global exports is America. We're 13% of global imports. That's the problem. We import 60% more than we export. That's unsustainable. That's the bubble. That's, again, and I'll get into Trump and his speeches, but that's what he doesn't understand. He thinks that the world is taking advantage of us. No, we're taking advantage of the world. They're letting us get away with this. We're importing 60% more than we export. And the way we pay for it is with debt. The United States, even though we're 26% of world GDP, we're 37% of world sovereign debt. And that's just if you count U.S. treasuries. If you count state and local debt, because most countries, they don't have all these states and cities borrowing like as much as we do. But if you throw in the state and local debt, we're 40% of the world's government debt. We're only 4% of the population. We owe 40% of the debt. That is an enormous liability that the United States has without the capacity, even close, to repay that. And so how are we financing all this debt? Again, it's the rest of the world that is making all this debt possible. It's not American savings, it's global savings. It's not American manufacturing, it's global manufacturing that is making up the gap. Yes, we do manufacture a lot in total, but not enough to cover our standard of living, our consumption. Our economy is being propped up. But I specifically wanted to focus on the stock market. That is not going to maintain that 67%. Either the U.S. stock market has to go way down or the rest of the world stock markets have to go way up. And I think it's going to be a combination of two. But what's really going to happen is an alignment of exchange rates. The dollar is going to tank. And when the dollar tanks, that all by itself readjusts the stock market percentages. Because when the dollar goes down, then the value of our stock market goes down relative to the rest of the world, assuming all their stocks stay the same, but the currencies that they're priced in go up. And that's where I think we're headed. I mean, the world has got completely fooled. They're, on what the implications are of a Trump presidency. They don't understand the structural nature of our economic problems, and that nothing Trump is going to do is going to even begin to scratch the surface of solving them. We still have a dollar crisis coming. We still have a sovereign debt crisis coming. All that is going to happen. That is going to realign these valuations. And so people should be, buying the foreign stocks, buying emerging markets, the type of stocks that I've been buying for years in anticipation of the events that are going to happen. It's taken longer for this thing to play out. And in the process, the imbalances have gotten bigger and bigger. I just think that creates an even bigger opportunity for the people that come to the party late, actually, to get an even better seat and to make an even bigger return and a faster return on their investment. Anyway, we got a quick commercial break. So stick around. I'm going to talk about some of the speeches that Donald Trump's been making. At least he can make them. He's probably made more talk to the press more in 1 week than Biden did in 4 years. So he spoke there. And he also did an interview with Sean Hannity. So I'm going to talk about some of the things that were said. But before I get to that, I want to talk about some economic statistics that came out, or events, the most significant in Japan. And nobody's really talking about it. Again, this is one of these warnings that I've been talking about that really goes unnoticed, by the mainstream. So Japan raised interest rates last night by 25 basis points. Now, that may seem, so what? What the big deal? 25 basis points, that's nothing. Well, they doubled rates because they were at 25 basis points and now they're 50. So rates doubled in Japan overnight. But that 25 basis point hike was the biggest hike in 18 years in Japan. 18 years. So things are changing down there. And it ain't going to be a pleasant what's about to happen in Japan. Now, rates have gone up, but they still have a long way to go because they also announced their inflation last night in Japan. And we got the number for December and the year over year. In fact, I only have the year over year numbers. And consumer prices as measured by the Japanese CPI, which I'm sure is flawed, like ours, maybe it's not quite as bad, but I'm sure it's not legit. But according to their CPI, prices rose 3.6% last year. 3.6. Interest rates are 50 basis points. A 10-year Japanese government bond, the JGB, yields 1.21, I think. Inflation is triple that yield. You have massive negative interest rates. That's not going to stay that way. Rates are going much higher. And the most ridiculous part about it is when the Bank of Japan raised interest rates, they still talked about making progress to achieving their 2% inflation goal. They're almost at 4%. What do you mean making progress? They way past that benchmark. They're looking in the rearview mirror at 2%. They may never see inflation that low again in Japan, 2%. I mean, they made it a number one policy. The reason the Japanese government has so much debt is because the Bank of Japan was committed to having 2% inflation when it was 1%. They should have left well enough alone. There's nothing wrong with 1%. It's better than 2%. 0 is better than 1, and -1 is better than 0. But of course, these Keynesian economists were able to hide behind this nonsense that the problems that Japan had were that we didn't have enough inflation. That wasn't the problem. That's false logic, right? The Japanese economy is weak and inflation is low. Aha! It must be the low inflation that has caused the economy to be weak. No, they got it backwards. And in fact, if inflation was higher, the economy would be even weaker. The low inflation was something good in an otherwise, bad economy, right? It wasn't the problem. It was one of the bright spots. But instead, they decided that we would have a stronger economy if only prices were rising faster. I mean, what an asinine economic strategy. Well, now they got to really pay the piper, because now, in order to get inflation up, they had to run up all this debt. And now what happens is now rates have to go up and they can't afford it. I mean, they can afford it more than we can, but not without major disruptions to the Japanese economy, because they're going to have big increases in taxes, which the Japanese can afford. They're going to have big cuts in government spending. What I think the Japanese are going to be doing is unloading over $1 trillion worth of U.S. treasuries.